Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one we will find out everything that we need to know about how to configure logging in ASP.NET Core. And I would like to get right into it and start from a very specific scenario where we can see a problem that we might be able to solve by configuring or by further configuring the logging in ASP.NET Core. So let us just get started. We have here this ASP.NET Core application, and by the way, we have used this application for the video about getting started with ASP.NET Core logging. So if you want a more getting started video with ASP.NET Core logging, then I will strongly encourage you to take a look at that. You will find the link in the description of this video, or you will find here on the screen a card. If you click on that, then you will be able to also watch that video. As said, that is a really getting started guide, and actually this solution that we have right now is exactly where we left off in that specific video. Now, going back here, let's execute this application. That's actually what I want to try right now, because I want to show something to you. And here, for instance, we have this default Swagger, and on the other screen, I guess we also have a console. And let me maybe bring the console over to this one. So these are the logs that are standard or that are generated when the application starts up. Now, if we execute our endpoint here, we'll see in the console that we have all the logs that we have generated, also in our controller and in our service, and including, of course, also this error and warning, which is actually very nice. Let me just close this for a moment, but let's keep here the console on screen because I want actually to show you something very interesting. Now, in that getting started video, I was saying that by default, so without doing anything out of the box, we have already configured for us some providers where we can actually send logs, or where logs are sent automatically when we just use this iLogger. So we don't have to configure anything for that. And we said that one of the providers is the console, and it's clearly that we can see all the logs here in the console that you can see right now on this window. And we have also said that another provider is the Windows EventLog. So theoretically, that would mean that all the logs that we will actually write, all the logs that we will write using our loggers should technically or theoretically also be present in that Windows event log. So let me switch to the other monitor and let's click here briefly on refresh. And you see here that we already have this warning, which, this one is the exception, the error, that's actually coming from ASP.NET Core. So this is from the weather forecast API controllers. So it's exactly the error that we have generated. And the same, we have also this warning. Now this error and this warning were generated from previous calls, but I would like to actually note that we don't have the information logs. So you saw here on the console that we have a lot of different information logs, both from the startup and then from our own controller and our services. But from all these logs that we have here, so actually on the event log, we just see, as we can see here, just the error and the warning. So, okay, seems to be something that is contradicting the theory that everything should also be logged to the event log. Let's go then back to the other screen for just a second, and let's also close this one. And the reason why we have this behavior is because of how actually logging is configured in ASP.NET Core. And by default, if we go to the appsettings.json file, we see here a very basic configuration for logging. And this comes out of the box. So this comes with the ASP.NET Core Web API template, and it's here to just help us get started and see some basic logs, like for instance, when the application starts up, and everything's fine. So let's take a look here into this logging object that we have here in our JSON file. And we see that actually our object here has this kind of LogLevel, which is like a general definition about what log levels do we want actually to log. and we can define different log levels for different loggers. And you probably recall that it's very important when we resolve an iLogger with dependency injection to also resolve the generic version of it. Like for instance, iLogger of weather forecast controller, because this would be the name of the logger that will kind of log, in our case, our warning, exceptions, and information that we have in our controller. So right here. So this is why we have this kind of like standard configuration. Now let's go back to the configuration. So we have this very general configuration for LogLevel, and we see here that for that as default we should have debug, even though I guess the standard should be the level of information when you create a new application. So that's fine. So we have a default, which means that, okay, unless I specify any other logger by name here in this section below, then this default log level will actually prevail. What this means is, it means that it will actually then log all logs that are from the information level, so log level information upwards. So it will log information, it will log warnings, and it will log errors. If we, for instance, would choose here, let's say debug, for instance, then it would mean that the general log level would be starting from debug and higher. So it would be debug, information, warning, and exception. Now, of course, on a development environment, there might be scenarios where you just also want to log debug to see exactly what's happening. But of course, when you think about deployment to production, and in fact, that's why we have different configuration files for production, for development, for test, because we might even do logging differently based on the environment, of course. Now, the idea is that here we specify this default. So how should loggers behave unless we specify otherwise here in these other sections? And then the cool thing is that we can say, for instance, then for each logger, we can specify exactly what type of log level it should log, or starting with which log level it should do the logging. And for instance, we can say here that we want, let's say, let's do this one. Let's include our logger. So our logger would be, if I recall correctly, weather forecast dot weather forecast or dot controller dot weather forecast controller. Though I'm really not 100% sure about this, but I guess we'll just take a look into the console when we run it, and we'll adjust this. And notice that we have specified here that we want a warning for that. So let's run the application again, and let's see exactly what it would happen right now. So we have this API. So we have all the information logs on the other screen. Just give me 1 second and I will bring them here. So let's try to execute this. So everything's okay. Let's just log here, and we see that, okay, this is actually the name of our logger. So let's just copy this one. Let's we'll leave this this console open, but we'll close debugging, and let's just here give then the fully qualified name, and we specify this one. So in this case, if we run again, now we can take a look here. We still see the logs that are logged by Microsoft Hosting Lifetime, of course, because that is like that. And if we execute, we go back, and we see here that we have here the logs from the service, but we don't have the logs from the controllers anymore. And that's because we have specified here in our logging configuration that for the logger that is the weather forecast controller logger, we should only log warning level and above of that. So this configuration then was applied, and of course then in our console we don't see the logs for our controller anymore. And for instance, what we could do here is also say that, let's do it like that. For everything that comes from weather forecasts, and we can then also use these wildcards. So we use this wildcard and we say that everything that is from weather forecasts, it should log only log level warning and above. So let's execute the application right now once again and take a look what an effect this has on our logging. And we see here the logs that we get from the console. Let's try this out, execute. Let's close it because we don't need it. In this case, we see that also from our loggers, we see just warning and errors. So you see how cool it is, that because we can then actually for each type of logger using the logger name to define very granularly exactly from which log level and above do we want to log. And things that actually happen here or that are defined here kind of like override what is the default. And this is very, very important to note. Now let's do one other thing. Let's, for instance, change this from Microsoft, and we will say that from Microsoft also we would like to use a wildcard. And in this case, let's run the application again. I guess that will already help us to see some nice things during the startup. Okay, here's the console. Good. So we see that right now, let's close it because we don't need it anymore. We see that right now, since we have said that for everything that's coming from Microsoft, just use the log level information and above, then we have suddenly a lot more information here in our console, because we see here that we also have then logs for each request, or for each request that actually Swagger made to our server in order to actually load that Swagger frontend. So we see here, for instance, this request that was for this endpoint, which is like a JavaScript file, and then was this other request that was then once again for JavaScript file. We had status 200 OK, and it took about 67 milliseconds. And then we have another one for another file, and this took 268 milliseconds. So you see that just by tweaking around a little bit with what we have here, we have already actually tweaked what we have as logging output into our console. And you would say, okay, but this doesn't really explain, for instance, why didn't we see that information for the information logs that we had in our controllers and our services? Why didn't we see them in the event log, in the Windows event log? Because this doesn't really explain it. And now I really want to get one step further with that. Because, okay, here in this log level, we can specify some default log levels for different loggers, and we can use those loggers by name. But then, of course, we have then some other ways to further work and configure this part of logging. So we should stay here in this logging section. But here, for instance, what we can do here is add a configuration for every provider. So what we can do here is then add this configuration for the event log. And here we would do exactly or similarly to what we have here, like the default configuration. We can specify here a log level, for instance, and that would be also an object like we had previously. And here in this object, we can define once again exactly the same way with the same level of granularity, what exactly do we want to log in our event log. And for instance, we can see here that maybe the default, so as a default in our event log, we just want to log critical. So that should be the default one. But then we can specify, for instance, that for our weather forecasts, and we can use the wildcard. And here, of course, we can then specify that it would be also from log level information and above. And here, if we run the application right now, I guess that should be a little bit different because right now from weather forecasts, we should be able to see everything that's actually starting with the log level information. So let's, for instance, run the application once again. And we'll see that our application starts. It should be okay, I guess. We have changed the configuration. So let's take a look exactly about what will happen right now. So let's just make a call here, and then just we should execute, and we can close this. We can just take a look in the console. So right now in the console, we see exactly the same things that we also have seen previously, because we have configured then the console, or the log levels for the console are used from the defaults that we see here. But let's then switch over to our event log and just click here, refresh. Where is the refresh? Here's the refresh. And we see that right now we have this error, we have this warning, but right now we also have this type of information logs that come, of course, from our loggers. Of course, when ASP.NET Core logs to the event log, it also adds a lot of other information about the log that was generated. But the idea that is that we have exactly then the action that was executed, and the information and everything that we actually want here. This information is the plain text that we actually log, and we have here this information, for instance, that was logged to the event log, and we have also this one that was logged to the event log, and everything else. So you see that basically this very, very basic configuration that we have done has actually helped us to make sure that our event logs, or that our logs, or that our information logs arrive right now also to the event log, because previously they actually weren't. So, which means that we have now seen that we were able to configure, let's say, the overall logging levels, but then we can configure for each logging provider the settings that we want to use for that specific provider. And the idea is that here in this event log, we just don't want to actually log everything that comes, for instance, from Microsoft. Like we saw in the console that we have, for instance, logging the HTTP requests, the startups log, and things similar to that. But we certainly want to have the critical logs that are generated. This means the exceptions that our application generates. But from our own loggers, like the loggers from our own application, in those cases, maybe we want to send some more information, for instance, to the event log. So what this actually means from the configure logging perspective is that once you then define a provider and you specify log levels in that provider, for that provider specifically, the settings that you provide here override the settings that you provide here. This means that here you can have some general guidance about what exactly do you want to log and starting from which log levels, but then you can go for each of the providers and specify more granularly for that provider only a different or a totally different logging configuration. And here we could, for instance, add a provider for the console so that we can further configure what we want to get logged in the console. But in the console, you usually want to get a lot of logs because they might help you to investigate issues and to see the overall flow of the application, which might be very, very important. But the important thing here is that if we add third-party logging providers, they kind of like work exactly the same, because what we would have to do is nothing else than come here back to the appsettings.json file and add some configurations that are specific for that third-party logging provider. Now, exactly how this is done, that really depends on each logging provider, because for instance, for nlog, you do this usually via an XML file. For Serilog, you do this in the appsettings.json file, so exactly like we do it here. But for those, we will have separate videos that we will cover then different third-party providers. Now, in this one, I really want us to grasp this concept that is really very powerful, and based on the experience that I had on real teams working on real applications, is that unfortunately, not a lot of people really understand about how this configuration of the logging works. And for instance, for some providers, from some third-party providers, they actually they may work side by side with the providers that you have here. And since you specify here something, it could be that sometimes if you are not careful about how you configure your logging, and you wonder, okay, but why does my log not let's say arrive to the log file that is generated or that is managed by nlog, for instance. And very, very often the response is because that log actually never got to the provider, because actually the configuration here was for a higher level than the log that we expected. And since we didn't have then a specific configuration for that provider, then that log actually never arrived to nlog so that it could be written on a file. This is a very concrete example that I had then on one of the applications we were working on. So once again, it's very important to understand that when we configure logging, we can then first of all provide some general guidelines and configuration about what log levels we want to log and from which loggers, in which we can use either fully qualified names of the loggers, or we can even use wildcards, for instance, to define a sub category of loggers so that we don't have to add all of them. We can just provide a subcategory then using this wildcard. But then you can configure for each provider dedicated options, and those options would kind of like override what we have here in this log level configuration. And this means that you would have to be very careful how you do this, but in the end, when you get the hang of it, it's actually very, very nice and powerful, because it really allows you to fully customize exactly the logging output that you want to have for each provider. And this is really, really nice, because in a real application, you would configure it in such a way that you would have some logs that are important for you. For instance, that for instance, even in the Windows event log, then you would want, of course, to have some logs in the console, but you would probably also want to have some logs sent to a third-party logging provider and to different things like a file or a database or something else that we will cover in further video. But everything and all the configuration, or at least that basic configuration, is done in a very, very powerful way and granular way here in this appsettings.json file, where you can configure exactly what do you want to log for which provider. And of course, when you add third-party providers, then there are a configuration specific for those providers, as said, but the general rule applies that you can customize or fully customize for each provider exactly what type of logs do you want actually to send. And that's basically it for this. Right now, we are ready to go maybe into some more advanced topics about logging. Now that we know exactly how we can inject and use loggers, and that we know how we can configure them in a very powerful and granular way, depending on our provider and on our logging let's say output sync. Now we will probably go then over to other topics, but for now, that's actually it. If you have questions, or if you just want to say something, don't be shy and use the comment section. I would be more than happy to get in touch with you and maybe get a discussion going. And if you think that this content might be useful for others, don't be shy once again, and feel free to share it with your friends, with your peers on social media, and wherever you see fit. Once again, thanks you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.